Have you ever wondered what betrayal looks like when it wears the face of someone you love? In the quiet stillness of a Palm Springs morning, she sipped coffee alone on the terrace, sunlight brushing her cheekbones like an old friend. To the world, she was Marilyn Monroe, an icon, a mystery, a woman sculpted by fame. But beneath the gold-trimmed sunglasses and silk robe was someone few had ever met. Someone who gave quietly, loved deeply, and trusted, perhaps too blindly. She wasn't returning from a movie set or glamorous gala, just a long weekend with family, full of laughter, old stories, and the comfort of shared bloodlines. At least it had seemed that way. Back in her private bungalow, she opened her bank account to make a simple transfer. Her fingers hovered, then froze. $13.47. Her breath caught. 2 days earlier, that same account held over $150,000. Now, it was nearly empty. She blinked once, then again, but the number didn't change. This wasn't a banking error. It wasn't a stolen purse or a Hollywood scam. It was something far worse. It came from inside the house, and the face behind it was family. She sat perfectly still, eyes locked on the screen as if the numbers might realign themselves, correct the error, reverse the wound. But they didn't. $13.47. Marilyn closed the app and reopened it. Same result. Her jaw clenched, not in panic, but in a slow, dawning awareness. An actress's instinct that something was very, very wrong. With steady hands that betrayed her inner disquiet, she reached for her private notebook, the one bound, in leather and tucked discreetly into a drawer. She flipped through the last entries, deposits from speaking engagements, modest investments she'd made quietly, far from the cameras and gossip columns. The total, even after taxes and expenses, had been just over $150,000. A sum she had kept separate from the public eye, protected from the industry, and shared only with her inner circle, those she considered family. She dialed the bank immediately, speaking in the smooth, composed voice that had charmed millions, though now laced with barely concealed tension. After the usual security checks, the representative hesitated before delivering the blow. The withdrawals were made from a device previously authorized under your profile, Miss Monroe. The access came from an IP address in Los Angeles, registered to Mr. Eugene Talbot. Marilyn's fingers stiffened around the receiver. Eugene, her former business manager, trusted advisor, and more tellingly, the one man in her life her half-sister Bernice still called Uncle Gene, with an affectionate smile. "How many transactions?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. 17, came the answer, all within the last 48 hours. The details spilled out like broken glass: wire transfers to unknown accounts, a sudden credit card approval in her name, a closed mutual fund. But what sent a chill down her spine wasn't the theft, it was the pattern. The precision. This wasn't someone desperate grabbing what they could. This was someone who knew where she kept her financial blind spots. Someone who had watched her long enough to know when she wouldn't be looking. She thanked the representative, hung up the phone, and sat in silence. The sounds of the outside world, birdsong, the distant hum of traffic, faded to nothing. Her eyes drifted to the framed photo on the mantel. A family barbecue from 2 summers ago. Bernice laughing, Teddy flipping burgers, Uncle Gene pouring lemonade. The betrayal wasn't just financial, it was personal, intimate. She stood, her silk robe falling softly around her ankles, and walked to the window. Beyond the palms and desert breeze, the world still looked as serene as ever. But inside her, something was shifting, something ancient and resolute. Not rage, not despair, clarity. They didn't think she would notice. They didn't think she would fight back. But Marilyn Monroe had played many roles in her life, and the one she was about to play now was the most dangerous of all, the woman who sees everything and says nothing. Not yet, because the performance was just beginning. The drive to Glendale was long, but her thoughts moved faster than the car itself. Each mile unraveled a new thread of suspicion, a new memory reframed under a harsher light. She had left behind the warmth of her Palm Springs retreat, trading solitude for confrontation, serenity for answers. The estate in Glendale, her childhood refuge, now stood like a stage she was being forced to return to. But this time, without a script. When Marilyn arrived, the sun was dipping low, casting gold across the Spanish-style tiles and ivy-covered gate. She took a breath and stepped out of the car, heels clicking sharply against the pavement, her presence as poised as ever. Inside, the house smelled of citrus and linen, familiar, almost comforting, until the sound of laughter rang from the back patio. She followed it. There, lounging under the pergola with a martini in hand, was Bernice, her half-sister, dressed in designer resort wear, legs casually crossed, sunglasses perched like a crown. Opposite her sat Teddy, ex-stepbrother-in-law, greasy smile and open shirt, revealing a gold chain he'd never had the means to afford. Marilyn stood for a moment, unnoticed, watching how easily they relaxed, as if nothing had shifted, as if nothing had been taken. Finally, she spoke. "Did either of you notice anything missing?" Bernice turned, her mouth curling into a soft, confused smile. "Darling, what are you talking about?" "My private account," Marilyn said evenly. "Over $150,000 gone, every cent. The bank traced the transactions to Jean's address." Teddy chuckled, not bothering to hide. Come on, Marilyn. You've got movie deals, endorsement checks, studio contracts. That kind of money is nothing to you." She stared at him. "You needed that money?" she asked. He leaned back in his chair. "We needed help. Jean said you wouldn't even notice. And we didn't exactly splurge. It went toward real stuff. Rent, debt, Haley's school." Marilyn turned to Bernice. Her expression hadn't changed. "I didn't authorize any of it." Bernice shrugged. "We thought it was fine. I mean, you're always helping us out anyway. This just saved you the trouble of saying yes again." Marilyn blinked slowly, as if steadying herself against invisible wind. "You used my trust like it was pocket change. And didn't even ask." "Don't be so dramatic," Bernice said with a soft laugh. "You're not struggling. You're adored. You live alone. You don't have kids. What's wrong with helping family?" In that moment, Marilyn realized it wasn't a mistake to them. It wasn't even a betrayal. It was something far more chilling: entitlement. She turned, ready to walk back inside, when Teddy added, "We all figured you'd just let it go. I mean, it's family." She paused mid-step, then looked back. Her voice dropped low. "That was your first mistake." And without another word, she disappeared into the hallway, her mind already racing with what she'd do next. Because if they believed she was just a symbol, a face, a wallet, they were about to learn who Marilyn Monroe really was. The silence that followed her words was brief, but it hung heavy in the air. Marilyn walked through the house slowly, each step echoing against the polished floors of her past. The same halls where she once played as a child, the same staircase where she sat crying after her first heartbreak, now seemed smaller, dimmer. She passed framed photographs lining the hallway, images of family vacations, birthdays, holidays, frozen smiles masking the quiet tension that had always lingered just beneath the surface. She entered the sitting room where Aunt Grace, her former guardian, was knitting by the fireplace, her motions rhythmic, detached, almost ceremonial. Without looking up, she said softly, "I heard voices. You back already, dear?" Marilyn stood beside the mantel, arms crossed. "They drained my account, Grace, without asking." The older woman paused, just for a moment, then resumed her knitting. "You've always had more than the rest of us. It's not like they went and bought yachts. It was rent, groceries, Haley's medical bills. Your money helped them survive. But I didn't offer it, Marilyn said, her tone sharp but restrained. They took it, and Eugene helped. Grace looked up this time, her eyes calm, almost too calm. You're always so sensitive, Marilyn. That's always been your trouble. You give, then resent it later. Because no one ever asked if I wanted to give, she snapped. It was assumed. The room fell quiet. From behind her, she heard her father's voice, Paul, muttering from his recliner, never lifting his eyes from the newspaper. Don't use harsh words. It's family business. Family business. That phrase struck like a slap, a phrase used to excuse every overstep, every silence, every stolen moment of peace. She turned back to Grace. Do you think it's normal that someone you trust logs into your private finances? Moves your savings like it belongs to them? Grace exhaled, exasperated. You left it open. On my computer. What did you expect? The implications stung more than the theft, that she was somehow responsible for her own violation. That carelessness excused betrayal. They talk about you like you're some saint, Marilyn said quietly. But you watched it happen, and said nothing. Because we thought you'd understand, Grace replied, setting the needles down at last. You're the strongest one, the lucky one. Everyone leaned on you because they knew you could take it. But who do I lean on? Marilyn asked, more to herself than to them. Who catches me? No answer came. Only the ticking of the clock and the distant clink of ice in a glass. She looked around the room once more. Every familiar face had become a stranger wearing a mask of convenience. Every reason they gave for why it was okay sounded like a well-rehearsed excuse. Marilyn Monroe, the world's golden girl, the adored muse, had just learned that within her own family, she was nothing more than a safety net, one they expected would never snap. But something inside her had just torn. And it wasn't going to be mended by silence. Long after the house had gone quiet, Marilyn sat alone in the guest room, the same one she used to sleep in during holidays. The scent of old linen and lavender drifted faintly in the air, but it did nothing to soothe the ache in her chest. She opened her suitcase, not to unpack, but to retrieve a small leather pouch tucked beneath her clothes. Inside were faded receipts, old telegrams, and crumpled money orders she had once sent with no questions asked. Proof of every time she had stepped in without being asked, convinced herself it was love. It started small. She remembered the first time vividly, 1955. Her sister Bernice had just been left by her husband. Marilyn had only just signed the contract for the 7-year itch, and money was still tight, but she wired $500 anyway. Just until I get back on my feet, Bernice had promised, but the requests never stopped. There was the time Teddy had gambling debts to a man in Reno. Marilyn quietly paid it off through a third party. She even flew down secretly, wearing sunglasses and a scarf, so the tabloids wouldn't catch her handing over a manila envelope full of cash. It's just one time, I swear, he'd said, tears in his eyes. Then came the more subtle asks. Haley's braces, Aunt Grace's overdue mortgage, Paul's knee surgery. Each presented like a small, manageable favor. Each cloaked in guilt if she ever hesitated. You're the only one who can, they'd say. You're doing so well. What they never said was thank you. She remembered the time she declined a European photo shoot because Bernice had called her crying. Her car had broken down, and she needed help getting to work. Marilyn paid for the repairs, a rental, and a month's insurance. She stayed in Los Angeles instead, telling the photographer she had prior commitments. No one ever knew. One Christmas, she'd bought gifts for everyone, wrapped them herself, and still found herself scolded for not getting something more special for Haley. A dollhouse had been on the list, but the one she bought wasn't big enough. Bernice had scoffed. You had one job. That night, Marilyn had stayed up crying, not from the words, but from how normal they made her feel, as if being taken for granted was just a natural part of being loved. She gave until she began subtracting, from herself. There were days when she'd skip lunch, not from vanity, but because she was saving to cover someone else's emergency. She passed on vacations, postponed dental work, ignored her own credit card bills, just to be the reliable one. The rock, the constant. But now, looking at the pile of proof before her, some yellowed, others frayed, she saw the truth laid bare. These weren't acts of love they cherished. They were debts they believed she owed. They didn't see the quiet moments when she questioned her worth, the nights she stared at the ceiling wondering if anyone would ever show up for her the way she had for them. The ache she felt knowing her name brought others comfort, but never brought her peace. She folded the receipts neatly, returned them to the pouch, and zipped it shut with finality. The weight of her sacrifices had never been measured in dollars. It had been measured in silence, in absence. In the way no one had ever asked, "Are you okay?" But the question no longer needed to come from them, because now she was ready to ask it herself. And this time, she would answer. The next morning, the sky over Glendale was gray, and the air hung thick with the kind of stillness that settles before something breaks. Marilyn stood at the window, holding a cup of black coffee untouched. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass. Not the woman the world adored, but the woman who had stayed quiet too long, who had let love disguise itself as obligation. She had always believed that if she gave enough, one day they would see her. But now she saw them. Clearly. She dressed carefully, not for vanity, but for resolve. A navy blouse, high-waisted trousers, and her hair pinned neatly back, businesslike, restrained, intentional. Then she pulled out the folder, the one she had started building during her sleepless night. Inside were photocopies of wire transfers, checks with her name on the sender line, and printed screenshots of her account withdrawals, dated, marked, highlighted. It wasn't just a record. It was a quiet confession of everything she'd allowed, and everything they had taken. By mid-morning, she was at the downtown office of Walter D. Bishop, a retired entertainment lawyer who had once helped her dissolve a contract in her early 20s. He greeted her with a long, knowing look and ushered her in without a word. The walls were lined with books and dusted plaques. There were no cameras here, no assistants, no curious onlookers, only a heavy silence between old friends. Marilyn laid the folder on his desk. "I need you to help me prove something," she said. "Not to the world, just to myself." He opened it slowly, eyes scanning the neat stack, his expression unreadable. "You've documented everything," he finally murmured. "Names, amounts, dates. This is enough to open a formal complaint with a financial fraud investigator." She shook her head. "Not yet. I'm not sure I want legal war. But I want clarity. I want to know who knew what, how far it went. I want someone to tell me the truth, because they have no choice." Walter nodded. "You're not the only one in this town with vultures for kin, but most people wait until it's too late to ask for truth." He handed her a business card. "I'll connect you with a private financial investigator, quiet, efficient, ex-FBI, you won't have to lift a finger." As she stepped back out into the street, the wind swept her hair gently across her face. The city pulsed around her as it always had, but something inside her had changed. It wasn't anger. It wasn't revenge. It was readiness. For the first time in years, she wasn't trying to protect anyone but herself. No more saving, no more silence. No more sacrificing her peace in exchange for temporary approval. She was done being the dependable one who never asked for anything. Now she would ask for everything she deserved, starting with the truth. Sunday arrived draped in soft sunlight, the kind that made everything appear warmer than it really was. Marilyn returned to the Glendale house not out of duty, but out of design. She had been invited for brunch. Bernice had sent the message herself, punctuated with a smiley face and a too casual, "Hope to see you." As if nothing had happened. As if Marilyn hadn't uncovered a meticulously orchestrated betrayal beneath the facade of family. She arrived precisely at 11. The garden table was set under a flowering pergola, white tablecloth fluttering slightly in the breeze. A crystal pitcher of lemonade sat beside a tray of croissants. Everything looked perfect, curated. The stage was set. Bernice stood first, air kissing her cheek. "You look beautiful," she purred. Teddy poured her a drink like he hadn't laughed. In her face days ago, Marilyn sat, placing her purse gently on the bench beside her. They chatted at first. Weather, a recent article, Haley's upcoming recital. She let them talk. Let the silence stretch around the parts they didn't want to acknowledge. Then, just before the quiche was served, she reached into her purse and placed a thick leather folder in the center of the table. No explanation. No ceremony. Teddy froze mid-pour. Bernice's fork hovered above her plate. "What's that?" Bernice asked, her tone light, falsely curious. Marilyn didn't blink. "Everything." Bernice opened it hesitantly. Inside, dated. Withdrawals, account access logs, statements marked with red pen. Marilyn spoke softly but clearly. "The transfers originated from Jean's device, but they benefited you. Both of you." "With your knowledge," Teddy scoffed. "You're turning this into a courtroom?" "I'm turning it into a truth room," she replied. Bernice lifted her chin, composure slipping. "You left it open, Marilyn. You were on Grace's computer. Anyone could have seen it." "So you admit it," Marilyn said calmly. "You saw it. You used it. Without asking." Bernice threw her napkin down. "You act like we robbed you. You've been helping us for years. What's the difference?" "The difference," Marilyn said, voice steady, "is consent. When someone gives, it's generosity. When someone takes without asking, it's theft." Teddy leaned forward, his bravado thinning. "We didn't buy yachts, Marilyn. It was rent, groceries, school fees." "And you think that makes it better?" she asked. At that moment, Grace emerged from the house with a bowl of fruit, pausing when she saw the papers. "What's this now?" she asked, already irritated. "I'm asking," Marilyn said, turning to her, "if you also knew. Or did you just look the other way?" Grace pursed her lips. "Family helps each other. You were always the strong one. We leaned on you because we had to." "No," Marilyn said, standing slowly. "You leaned on me because you knew I wouldn't scream, because I was easy to drain." The table was silent. Even the breeze had stilled. "You always played the martyr," Bernice snapped. "Like you were above it all." "You think this changes anything?" "It changes everything," Marilyn replied. "Because now I'm no longer confused about who you are." She looked around the table one last time. The same faces. But the illusion was broken. They weren't her safety net. They were the ones who'd been slicing through it all along. She picked up the folder, slid it back into her purse, and said quietly, "Enjoy the brunch." And then she walked away, heels clicking like punctuation marks, leaving behind the table, the lies, and the version of herself who had tolerated them all. By Monday morning, the whispers had already begun. Marilyn sat at the vanity in her Los Angeles apartment, brushing her hair as the radio played softly in the background. She wasn't due on set, wasn't attending any public events. She had something else planned, something calculated, something quiet, yet louder than any headline could ever scream. The folder from the brunch sat closed on the desk behind her, but its contents had already been duplicated, scanned, and sent where they needed to go. That afternoon, she arrived at the studio, not as the actress, but as the woman behind the name. She had called in a favor from an old friend at one of the networks, a personal on-camera interview framed as a heart-to-heart. They'd pitched it as a vulnerable celebrity piece. Marilyn opens up about what really matters. She let them believe that. What they didn't know was how carefully she had constructed every word of what she was about to say. Under soft lighting and a lavender blouse, Marilyn sat before the camera with practiced calm. "There comes a time," she said slowly, "when a woman must ask herself, who is protecting me while I'm protecting everyone else?" She didn't name Bernice, or Teddy, or Grace. But every anecdote, every veiled reference to betrayal, to quiet theft disguised as family need, was unmistakable. "Sometimes," she said softly, "it's not strangers who take from you. It's the ones who know you'll never say no." The producer called it raw and brave. The network was thrilled. It aired nationwide 2 days later. She didn't watch it, but she didn't have to. Within hours, tabloids ran pieces speculating about Marilyn's inner circle. Columnists praised her for speaking out. Fans flooded forums with support. But behind the scenes, the real movement had already begun. Lorraine, her quiet cousin on her father's side, barely spoken to at family gatherings, always the one in the corner with a book, reached out through a discreet note. "I saw what you did, and I want to help." Turns out Lorraine had more than a library card. She worked in finance, had quietly kept records, knew about small payments made to shell accounts, payments that lined up with some of Marilyn's own missing funds. She'd always been suspicious but never dared speak up, until now. Lorraine handed over a small folder. "Names, account numbers, patterns. This is only part of it," she said. "But it's enough to raise questions." Marilyn accepted it with quiet gratitude. Not just for the contents, but for the courage it took to hand them over. She had long believed she was alone in this. Turns out someone had been watching too. Silently, carefully waiting for a sign. With the help of Walter's financial investigator, Marilyn's case shifted gears. No longer just personal documentation. Now, it was formal. An internal inquiry was opened. Paper trails began to surface. Jean's name appeared linked to unauthorized transactions going back 2 years. Teddy's gambling debts were matched to withdrawals from Marilyn's locked accounts. The people who once treated her as a bank without boundaries were now being seen through a different lens, not as family, but as suspects. And the most beautiful part of it all? Marilyn never raised her voice, never threatened, never warned. She simply told the truth, slowly, publicly, and with the full weight of her poise. Behind closed curtains, justice had already begun. And this time, she wasn't acting. The fallout didn't arrive with thunder. It came like a cold draft under a closed door, slow, certain, impossible to ignore. Within 2 weeks of Marilyn's televised interview, the press began connecting dots. Though she never mentioned names, it didn't take much for journalists to piece together the clues. The timeline of her statements aligned too perfectly with her known family ties, and soon, anonymous sources started speaking. Neighbors, former assistants, even a housekeeper from Glendale. One morning, Marilyn awoke to a string of missed calls. Teddy had been approached outside a casino by 2 men in suits, asked about offshore accounts. Not long after, Bernice's face was caught in the background of a photograph leaving the courthouse. Pale, sunglasses on, lips tightly pressed. That same day, Jean Talbot's office in West Hollywood was shuttered. A printed sign read, "Closed. For maintenance." But those close to him whispered otherwise. The financial crimes investigator had filed formal reports, irregularities in Eugene's books, multiple flagged transactions from accounts connected to Marilyn's trust fund, his. License was suspended pending investigation. Marilyn received the news in a short, dry letter from the state board. She folded it once, set it down, and stared at it for a long time. Not with triumph, just a hollow relief. Then came the messages. From Bernice. "I don't understand how you could do this to us. We're your family." From Teddy. "You've made your point. Can you call them off now?" Even Grace left a voicemail. "You're breaking something that can't be fixed, Marilyn. Please, enough." But none of them said they were sorry. None of them asked how she was holding up. What stung most wasn't the consequences they now faced. It was the confirmation that, even in their panic, they couldn't see her as a person. Only as the one who'd stopped giving. Still, the illusion was crumbling, piece by piece. News outlets reported that Jean's finances were under federal scrutiny. A warrant was issued to freeze one of Teddy's joint accounts. The private school, where Haley was enrolled, quietly reached out to Marilyn, unsure if the tuition Bernice had promised would clear. She didn't respond. Lorraine, ever discreet, kept her updated from the sidelines. "The dominoes are falling," she wrote in a short note. "They never thought you'd stand up." And Marilyn hadn't. Not for years. She had held their secrets, like wounds pressed into silk. Had endured the quiet belittling, the emotional slights disguised as concern, the endless expectation to carry the weight of others' mistakes with a smile. Now that she had drawn a boundary, they called it cruelty, but she called it clarity. One evening, as she stepped into her car outside the studio, a reporter called out, "Miss Monroe, any comment on the rumors?" She turned, smiled faintly, and said only, "I think some stories tell themselves." She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to explain. The woman they thought they could manipulate had become the woman they couldn't touch. And in the place where their illusion used to live, there now stood something far more dangerous. A woman who saw them clearly, remembered everything, and no longer owed anyone silence. She left Los Angeles on a Thursday morning without telling anyone. No goodbye press release, no final appearance. Just one small suitcase, her dog-eared journal, and a handwritten list of places she'd once visited and quietly loved. She drove north along the coast, her scarf billowing in the wind, until the sun dipped behind the Monterey cypress trees and the cliffs gave way to the soft, quiet charm of Carmel by the sea. The town didn't care who she was. That's what drew her to it. Here, Marilyn wasn't an icon. She wasn't a scandal or a muse or a headline waiting to happen. She was just another woman renting a whitewashed studio apartment above a flower shop, with a view of the hills and a small window that let in the morning light. She began each day slowly, something she had forgotten how to do. No urgent calls, no requests for help, no one asking, "Can you just do this one thing?" She drank her coffee warm for once. She bought fresh bread and ate it by the window. She read poetry again, Pablo Neruda, Edna St. Vincent Millay, verses she hadn't touched since she was 20 and hopeful. One afternoon, she wandered into a small bookstore and noticed a help-wanted sign. She asked about it, more out of curiosity than need. The woman behind the counter didn't flinch at her. "Name, it's part-time. Mostly sorting books and keeping track of inventory," she said, then added with a kind smile, "You'd be perfect." Marilyn took the job, not because she needed the money, but because she wanted something untouched by expectation. There, she spent hours among pages and dust, reshelving titles, sipping tea, and letting the quiet heal the places that fame and family had long trampled over. She began photographing again, too, not for magazine covers, but for herself. She'd walk the coastline with an old film camera slung over her shoulder, capturing light and shadow and the candid moments of strangers. It felt like breathing. It felt like being seen, finally, by her own eyes. At night, she cooked simple meals, pasta with olive oil, steamed vegetables, nothing extravagant, but made with care. She filled her space with plants, soft fabrics, and little objects that made her feel calm. A jar of lavender, a small bowl of polished stones, a ceramic cup she found at the weekend market, Slowly, her face relaxed. The furrow between her brows faded. Her laughter, once carefully curated for cameras, now bubbled up unexpectedly, sometimes at nothing at all. And people began to know her, but differently. A neighbor who brought over fresh-picked oranges. A barista who remembered her order. A retired screenwriter who invited her to poetry readings. No one asked for photos. No one asked for money. They asked how she was feeling, if she liked the weather, if she'd read the new book that just came. And for the first time in years, she answered those questions honestly. Marilyn wasn't rebuilding her reputation. She wasn't seeking forgiveness or trying to prove anything. She was rebuilding something far more sacred, her sense of self. And in this little town that had never known her as anything but a quiet woman who loved books and took long walks with a camera, she wasn't haunted by who she had been. She was finally discovering who she could become. It was a gray, misty morning when the letter arrived, tucked between a flyer for a local jazz night and a postcard from the bookstore's distributor. The envelope was pale cream, addressed in a careful, unfamiliar hand. Marilyn opened it without thinking, expecting another vendor invoice or a neighbor's thank you. But as she unfolded the single sheet inside, her breath caught. "Dear Miss Monroe," it began. "You probably don't remember me, but I remember you." The letter came from a young woman named Celia Harper, a former production assistant on one of Marilyn's last films before her quiet retreat from Hollywood. Celia had always been invisible on set, the one running errands, holding boom mics, and keeping her head down. But in her letter, she recounted a day Marilyn had offered her a seat beside her during lunch, asked her about her dreams, and then quietly slipped her the name of a screenwriting mentor she knew. "That was the first time anyone in that industry saw me as more than just a pair of hands," Celia wrote. "But what you did this year, that interview, the silence that followed, and everything between the lines, meant more." She went on to explain how, like Marilyn, she had once been the strong one in her family. The dependable one. The one who was told over and over, "You've got it together, so help the rest of us." She had drained her savings covering her father's loans, supported a brother through addiction recovery, and said yes long past when her soul had said no. Celia admitted, she had watched Marilyn's quiet unraveling from afar, not with judgment but with awe. It gave her language for something she hadn't known how to name, the exhaustion of being everything for everyone. "When you stood up for yourself, you stood up for people like me too," Celia wrote. "You reminded me that boundaries aren't walls, they're doors we choose to close when we've been left open too long." By the end of the letter, Marilyn's hands were trembling. Not from sadness, but from the strange sensation of finally being understood. Not as a symbol, not as a star, but as a woman who had quietly reached her edge and had chosen, for once, not to fall. She pressed the letter to her chest and sat by the window for a long time. Outside, the fog hung low over the hills, but inside her something luminous stirred. This was the reason she hadn't turned back. Not for revenge, not for applause, but for moments like this. Proof that her voice, even wrapped in restraint, had echoed where it mattered. She took out her journal and wrote just one line beneath the date. "The quietest acts of courage are the ones that set others free." And for the first time, she believed it. Years ago, the world only saw her through the lens of glamour, mystery, and silver screen perfection. But behind the name, behind the fame, was a woman who bled silently from wounds no camera could capture. Marilyn Monroe had given her heart, her money, her time, believing that love meant never withholding. But what she learned, finally and fully, was that real love respects limits. It doesn't take without asking. It doesn't silence you in the name of family. In walking away from those who expected her to burn just to keep them warm, she didn't lose her legacy. She reclaimed it. She reminded all of us that choosing yourself isn't betrayal. It's bravery. So, Maybe the real story isn't about what they took from her. It's about what she finally took back. And perhaps the question we should all ask ourselves is this: when was the last time you said no, not out of cruelty, but out of self-respect? Let us know in the comments. Have you ever had to walk away from family in order to protect your peace? If this story spoke to you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true-life narratives that honor strength, truth, and quiet rebellion.